Thank you very much for joining us today for what I think promises to be a very high impact and timely conversation. Our webinar is about CMMC in 2025, what defense contractors need to know, and particularly the impact of Ms. Katie Arrington now becoming the CIO, acting CIO of the Department of Defense. So as many of you are familiar, the final rule for CMMC has been released, initiating the compliance timeline. And with Katie Arrington returning to the Department of Defense as Chief Information Security Officer and acting CIO, the commitment to implementing CMMC is self-evident. Ms. Arrington, for those that don't know, was a key architect of the original CMMC framework and is now focused on its enforcement within the DoD and its potential expansion across other federal agencies. Whether you're a small subcontractor or a major defense prime, this program will impact your ability to win and retain contracts. The risk of inaction, especially with Ms. Arrington now at the helm, is significant. To help us navigate the path ahead, we are very honored to be joined by Michael Gruden, who's a partner at one of the top U.S. law firms dealing with compliance, Crowell and Mooring, headquartered in Washington, D.C., and an international law firm. Michael is a certified information privacy professional, a CIPP, and a CMMC registered practitioner or an RP. Prior to joining Crowell, he served nearly 15 years in the U.S. Department of Defense and U.S. Department of Homeland Security, including as branch chief for information technology and physical security, acquisitions at the Pentagon. And by the way, the acquisitions is where the CMMC program will get executed. His extensive experience includes assisting government contractors with federal contract compliance, cybersecurity assessments, and incident response. Michael also sits on the appeals board for the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Accreditation Body, or CyberAB. And I think what makes Michael truly unique and why I am truly excited about this webinar is that he brings both legal and operational expertise to the table. I don't recall that combination ever being brought to a webinar by us, and we do a lot of them. He's not only a lawyer who understands the regulatory landscape very well, but also is a hands-on CMMC practitioner who knows what it takes to achieve CMMC compliance. So if I may, I think this is a webinar that many who are in the audience today and those that aren't should probably make as mandatory viewing by their companies' CIOs and CEOs, especially if they are smaller companies. Michael, a very warm welcome. We're truly privileged to have your insights today.
Thanks so much, Sanjeev. We're really excited to be here and appreciate the opportunity.
My name is Sanjeev Verma. I'm chairman and co-founder of Prevail. We have about 1,800 defense contractors as customers that we are assisting with CMMC compliance. The majority of them are small and medium businesses, and we provide end-to-end encrypted email and file sharing to protect CUI and robust documentation to help become compliant. And we have now dozens of customers that have, through the JSV and the regular CMMC program, achieved CMMC certification, and many C3PAOs or assessors themselves got certified using Prevail. So moving on to today's discussion with Michael that I am truly excited to host. What to expect in 2025? Michael, with the CMMC final rule now in place, what should defense contractors anticipate in 2025 regarding implementation, enforcement, and overall impact?
I think my initial response to that would be more regulation, more enforcement, and more CMMC. And what I mean by that, sort of starting off with more regulation is, I think that there's more to come, even in light of the Trump administration's sort of focus on deregulation and reining some of that in. I think that we're naturally going to see more regulation when it comes to cybersecurity, not even just with CMMC, but when we look more broadly right now out in the pipeline is the draft FAR CUI rule that would essentially broaden the requirements of CMMC, not just within the defense industrial base, but the entire federal government wide, meaning if we have contractors that are doing work not just with the Defense Department, but any other civilian agency, those same requirements would then now apply more broadly to that too. So that's something else to be mindful of, and I think only elevates the compliance burden for many contractors that are doing work with the federal government. When I say more enforcement, what I mean by that is I think that there's going to be a continued scrutiny, both from federal agencies and particularly the Department of Justice, with regards to how companies are complying with the various IT security requirements that are contained within their contracts, not just purely even the DFARS clause that's implementing CMMC or the existing DFAR 7012 clause, but the individual security requirements that are contemplated and expressed in contracts. We still continue to see a prevalence of enforcement. We're seeing a myriad of settlements coming out of the Civil Cyber Fraud Initiative. And so we don't in any way anticipate that to cease. And then lastly, when I speak of more CMMC, I think there is only a matter of time that we likely will see then that final rule that will implement the actual clause for CMMC into individual contracts. I think that's only going to exponentially increase the reach and the requirements of CMMC for most contractors that are handling regulated data.
Yeah, those are very pertinent comments. And again, in the interest of, providing clarity, they are of course very consistent with what our understanding is. But I think in the audience, there may be several who feel that the imperative for, reduced regulation in the current administration might be construed as, impacting CMMC. But what your comments are outlining is that because these cybersecurity regulations, the America First initiative is kind of at odds with saying, hey, we put America first, and so we're going to go and reduce cybersecurity. It's at odds with that. And so your comments, I think, kind of highlight the greater regulation when it comes to cybersecurity and enforcement. So thank you for clarifying. Now, am I off base in kind of the more simplistic explanation of what you just said?
No, I completely agree. And I think that that isn't sort of an accurate summation and not to get ahead of some of our other discussion points for the webinar today, but I do think that something that's notable that we've seen even over the last couple of months of the Trump administration is there really has not been any rescission of existing cybersecurity executive orders, even from prior administrations. And I think that that's notable. You're calling out that I've sort of practiced both on the legal side, but also as a practitioner in cybersecurity, and that's accurate. But on the legal side, myself and many of my other partners and colleagues at our law firm have been very closely monitoring every executive order that's come out, distilling that and summarizing the impact to our broad clients internationally. But something that really resonates and I think is a fascinating talking point is there has been no degradation of cybersecurity requirements. There has been no repeal of those, nor have there been any direct executive orders that are directly in any ways minimizing the cybersecurity standards nor addressing CMMC. And I think that that in and of itself makes a resounding statement of the pertinence of working towards CMMC compliance, but also indicating that it's highly unlikely that we're going to see this completely be dissolved.
Makes total sense. Again, when we think about it these way, the way that you've articulated it, both looking objectively at the executive orders, but also the common sense of, look, this is an administration that's committed to an America First policy, and having weaker cybersecurity is not consistent with their aim and their commitment to America First. And so, speaking of that, let's talk a little bit more about the specifics of CMMC and particularly the impact of the return of Katie Arrington. So, given your experience with government stakeholders, how does Katie Arrington's return as DoD CISO, Chief Information Security Officer, influence the future of CMMC and its potential expansion beyond the Department of Defense? And for those that may not be familiar, please tell us a little bit about who Katie Arrington is and her prior role.
I think at minimum, the return of Katie Arrington is a positive indicator of CMMC and its sort of staying power. I think at best, I think that she will likely be a strong and staunch champion of the CMMC program, which she was under the first Trump administration. And for some of you that are not familiar, prior to this administration and the former Trump administration, Ms. Arrington was responsible there, was sort of overseeing the CMMC program. She sort of spearheaded that in terms of its implementation initially under phase 1 or the 1.0 version of CMMC. She really was the person that was out engaging with industry. I attended industry events myself and dialogue with Ms. Arrington at those with regards to its implementation, and she had a robust engagement where she was sort of literally had sort of a roadshow where she was going around meeting with industry, hearing stakeholder concerns, and really pushing that forward. And I think part of her engagement also resulted in a myriad of contractors' feedback on the 1.0 version of CMMC, which now we see significant changes to the program where now it went from 5 levels to 3, and there are very other iterations of it that occurred and that evolved as a result of that engagement. I think what's notable about that now is that as Ms. Arrington has returned, she has a new role. And I think it's notable that prior to actually her new appointment, back in 2022, that the CMMC program itself was transferred out of the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment over to the DoD Office of the Chief Information Officer. That's notable because now, as you just pointed out, Sanjeev, that Ms. Arrington is currently acting in the role of the DoD CIO. I think to me, I can only intimate them that, her and her functional capacity as a CIO and having responsibility of the CMMC program within that go hand in hand. And I think that that again is another clear indicator that it's likely that she will continue to shepherd that program, which again was sort of seen positively and viewed positively by the Trump administration under the first term. And I don't see that changing in terms of what we're seeing today under the second term.
Hey, Michael, if I could add, I mean, I do know Ms. Arrington a little, and she's a force of nature, and her commitment to the program is at a personal level. So she was relentless in pushing for this program when she was CISO for acquisition. She's arguably the mother of the program and is tireless and personally committed. And so you got a unique combination of a top government official who happens to have a strong personal conviction and commitment to the program and was its creator. So I think it should be self-evident. And I think she's made statements since she returned that she is going to push and push hard for its adoption and its expansion. To tell us a little bit about what are you hearing about Ms. Arrington's interest in potentially expanding the program beyond the DoD?
I think that's an interesting question. That's been something that's been discussed by industry for multiple years in terms of what does it look like to sort of broaden the usage and the role of CMMC. I know that we've seen and heard interest of various other international entities to sort of utilize that program. And I think even as of last week, we saw the release from Canada, a new cybersecurity standard referred to as CPSC that very closely aligns with CMMC. And so all that to say is that there is broader international interest in a cybersecurity certification program similar to CMMC. So I would not be surprised to see that over time become more of a broader sort of industry standard that would be adopted internationally. We already are seeing that even in certain instances with the underlying cybersecurity standard that is foundational of CMMC, which is NIST 800-171. That's been around for more than a decade. But that standard itself has been adopted in many ways determined to be sort of an industry best practice by many multinational corporations. So it would not be in any ways contrary, if you will, to see broader international adoption since we're already seeing that underlying standard adopted and recognized internationally.
Well, Michael, in our webinars, we always make sure that every voice is heard. And so I want to put forth the voice of the contrarian over here. And that pertains to the role of the Doge. Many in the audience may be speculating about the role that Doge might have in impacting CMMC. So the Department of Defense's Office of Chief Digital and AI Officer, Doge, has gained much attention for its efforts to streamline the federal government. Can you elaborate on Doge's potential role and its implications for the program's future direction? And when I say the program, I mean CMMC.
We've not really heard any official comments out of the Office of Doge with regards to its impact or effect on CMMC. I think, back to the point that I made earlier on with regards to the recent executive orders and rescission of existing executive orders, the fact that cybersecurity has stayed out of that fray, I think is significant. And I think it indicates that it's likely to sort of have staying power. One way that I think we could see some of the Trump administration's focus sort of on minimization or streamlining of regulations affect CMMC could be with the rolling out of the ultimate 48 CFR, which is the underlying DFARS clause that implements the CMMC clause to implement those certification requirements. When we've heard in the past, many might have heard of phased implementation, and that all is premised upon the actual implementation of that final DFARS clause at 48 CFR. In order for that clause to be released, we're still kind of in this waiting period in that there's already been a draft that's been released. There's already been a comment period that's closed. So we're really not just waiting for that final publication. From our understanding, and even from comments made by Stacy Bosjanik, who is the CMMC program director, who we know quite well and have a great respect for and a great relationship with, from even comments that she's made publicly, that I think one aspect of the Trump administration that could in some ways sort of bottleneck that current process that she intimated was that there was that sort of new Executive Order 14192 unleashing prosperity through deregulation. Essentially, what that regulation or that EO required was for every new regulation that was created by a federal agency, 10 needed to be removed or deregulated. I think that right now is in some ways likely causing a delay in the release of that 48 CFR. From what I understand and what Ms. Bosjanik has stated publicly was that right now there are only two ways that they could sort of overcome that executive order. The first would be if there was a national security exception that was made, where again, through the usage of CMMC, it was understood that there were national security reasons for implementing this requirement, and therefore that 10-to-1 requirement was removed. Otherwise, what we understand concurrently is happening is that there's engagement at the Pentagon with Pentagon executives that in the E-ring, so to speak, where I used to sort of walk around a lot, is that they're sort of sourcing around for what existing regulations from various DoD components or activities could actually be removed, and they would need to identify those 10 so that then they can actually then release that final rule for the CMMC under the 48 CFR.
And Michael, for those that aren't lawyers and don't understand CFR 32 and 48, could you explain to the audience the significance of CFR 32 and 48 and why are they pertinent to the contractors preparing for CMMC compliance?
Sure. I think that's a great question, and it is important to distinguish the two. And so CFR stands for Code of Federal Regulations. Essentially, any type of rulemaking or federal program that's codified is included within these Code of Federal Regulations. That essentially is what makes it law. So the 32 CFR actually was released with regards to the CMMC program back in December. And that was pivotal because what it did was it formalized, codified the CMMC program. And what we mean by that is that it unveiled the entire rule that had the whole program itself, both the certification requirements, what the standards were to attain one of the three different levels, dependent upon the type of regulated data that's handled. And it also, within that, included the entire provisions for external assessors. Under CMMC, they're referred to as Certified Third-Party Assessing Organizations, or C3PAOs. That entire certification process for the assessors, the adjudication process, the ethics and code of conduct for both the assessors as well as for companies seeking assessments, all of that is incorporated within the CMMC program that was unveiled in December. And why that's important is that through that codification, through the finalization of the program itself, that enabled C3PAOs as assessors to begin conducting assessments of companies that are ready to obtain their CMMC certifications. Prior to that, companies were unable to receive an official CMMC certification, but because that program is final, those assessments can now be conducted and companies can attain those certificates. Separately, when we're talking about 48 CFR, that is a section within the Code of Federal Regulations that pertains to all federal contract clauses for every federal agency, including the Department of Defense. Once that specific contract clause that we were referring to earlier for CMMC is finalized, that will then usher in that, quote, phased implementation that I referred to, that then you'll see various instances of the CMMC requirements appear in various solicitations, contracts, and then ultimately in option exercises and in contract modifications. However, one thing that I want to note, though, is that even though we're waiting for that 48 CFR, that CMMC clause to be finalized, even now we're starting to still see the CMMC requirements appear in various solicitations and in various kind of government inquiries. And you might be wondering, well, how is that if we're waiting on the clause? How can they do that now? The reason why is because of the 32 CFR. The fact that the program itself has been codified, it has been formalized and recognized by the federal government. Therefore, it is now a recognizable standard and it can be implemented by the government in various contracts. And I will note that even within the 32 CFR itself, it does contemplate and sort of afford individual agencies or activities to utilize the CMMC program at its discretion. And that's precisely what we've seen over the last 2 months, where we're seeing it in some RFP requirements, where again, as a condition of award or as a condition of sort of a down select, if you will, that there's a requirement to actually have a certification requirement. And I think at the time of the solicitation, at least, the requirement was to have a CMMC certificate in hand around, I want to say, April or May. It was quite aggressive. Separately, just in sort of our general day-to-day contract counseling for many of the government contractors that we counsel within our firm, we've also seen other inquiries from the government asking various contractors when they actually plan to obtain certification, where they are in their process, and when they sort of anticipate having that fully completed. There are various ways that we're seeing that arise in contracts. So all that to say, even though we're waiting for 48 CFR, the CMMC train is frankly already out of the station and it's already moving along in select instances. And I think that we'll only see more of that sort of as procurements arise. And, again, putting on my former CO hat, recognizing that, September 30th is, the day that every contracting officer knows, and I knew because I never took any vacation in September, but that's the end of the fiscal year for the government, right? And that's when they actually execute almost more than 2/3 of their contracts in that last quarter. So I think as we naturally see an increase in contract activity and solicitations over the next several months, so too I think we'll see more CMMC requirements ideally appearing in some of these DoD contracts.
So that's really a key piece of information that you're provided, that CMMC is already being included in part of the solicited.
Yeah.
Now let's kind of make it ultra simple for several that haven't started their journey and are contemplating and speculating, will it be there, won't it be there, etc. So let's say there's one of these contracts that you're referring to that have the CMMC clause, and you are either a prime or a subcontractor interested in that contract. What does this thing mean for you? How should you think about it? And again, think of it from the perspective of, let's say you've done something about CMMC or that you are just thinking about it and haven't done it. How would you perceive your preparation and readiness to kind of be a potential bidder for those contracts?
I mean, in that instance, there would definitely be a lot of work that would need to occur, and before you would actually be able to have that CMMC certification in hand. And what I mean by that is companies sort of don't just wake up the next morning and say, you know what, let's be CMMC compliant today. It unfortunately is not that simple. When we think about the underlying security requirements that are based upon that standard I mentioned earlier, NIST 800 171, there are over 110 controls that sort of touch on a myriad of various sort of IT and sort of safeguarding requirements. A lot of them can be achieved technologically. Others require physical security, where you're sort of securing the physical perimeter and access to various types of data, both in the electronic and the physical instance. And then many policies have administrative components. I mean, you need to have a robust sort of IT governance and policies and procedures that are accurately depicting how a company are implementing these various controls. All that does not happen within a day. It doesn't even happen within a month. Most companies, it requires at least a 6 to 12 month kind of build out, both sort of on the technical side as well as the administrative and physical side to do that. And that's not all, because again, while you're wanting to sort of build in that program, the other underlying requirement to demonstrate your compliance is having written documentation that describes how you're meeting all of these controls. That document is referred to as a system security plan. And within that, you need to describe how you're meeting all those individual control requirements, as well as many sub-objectives that we've not really discussed yet. But some controls can have anywhere from 3 or 4 to 8 or more sub-requirements that are necessary to be found as meeting the entire control itself. All that to say, a lot of that requires, an acute attention to detail and written documentation describing how these are all met. But wait, there's more. The last part of that, particularly from CMMC, is that you need to then actually schedule an assessment with a C3PAO. And it's sort of not like sort of just driving up to, the ATM asking for a withdrawal. You have to get in line, you have to wait your turn. And it's not simply like to sort of go into one single practitioner. It's important to actually look around and find a C3PO that aligns on it with your business objectives. Just like every physician is not one and the same, so too, not every C3PO are not one and the same. And that's something that we've helped many of our clients in terms of engaging with various C3POs that we know sort of through the industry. And we've sort of scheduled various sort of introductory meetings and sort of having them talk through how they go about assessing certain requirements, how they approach assessing, a facility or a company that might have over 500 facilities or business units, or how they go about sort of remediating a control, or what their specific perspective is of finding that a control is implemented. All these nuances matter. And I think the more that a company can come into preparedness for that, but also a clarity of what particular C3PO aligns with their objectives, then they can begin scheduling that and working towards that. The last component to that I'll add is, again, prior to even having that C3PO assessment, many companies are increasingly wanting to have a privileged pre-audit assessment. And that's important for multiple reasons. The first reason that you want it to be privileged, and we'll get this into down the road, is that any external assessment, not a C3PO, but any other external assessment against your cybersecurity requirements, could be discoverable by the federal government if there was any type of government audit, investigation, data breach, or lawsuit. And we've seen those external assessments being used robustly as evidence of contractors' non-compliance with various standards, and it's resulted in settlements from the federal government in tens of millions of dollars. So again, companies are increasingly recognizing that it's almost imperative that they have these external assessments conducted under privilege. And what that means is having either a firm that has those technical competencies in-house like we do, or working with another external consultant, but having another law firm overseeing conduct that at the direction of the firm, so that then any findings would not be discoverable. Meaning you really don't want your dirty laundry aired out before kind of a wide, audience. And through having attorney-client privilege, you're insulating, you're protecting those potential findings. Going back though to the pre-audit assessment, why that's important is that you don't want to go and have a CMC assessment by a C3PO and realize that that you fail because you did not have, the proper documentation, you lacked robust policies, or that some of your technical implementation was not fully realized. Those are the no-fault environments in a pre-audit assessment, ideally privileged, that you'd want to have so that you have a higher degree of confidence once you have that CMMC assessment that you'll obtain the certification.
I think these are really, really important points that you're making about the privilege assessments, pre-assessments. And I would like to say that, while certainly those sorts of things should be very much availed of, and large enterprises certainly will, in our own way, we kind of help our clients, 1,800, 2,000 of whom are, small and medium businesses, with providing them sort of the detailed documentation, the policies and procedures, etc. And then this point that you made about C3PO discovery. So what we do to help clients is, we pre-check our documentation, have an assurance that it has been validated by dozens of C3PAOs. And then if a client wants, as you wisely suggest, to say, hey, I'd like to get an assessment, then Prevail also says, well, here are a few that are very familiar with what we're doing, understand the documentation, we can make introductions, and then you decide based on your requirement which one fits well. And that process has been super successful, and dozens of our customers have availed of the opportunity to become CMMC compliant with that. So with that, I want to go back to a question that you've already answered, but I want again to be re-emphasized over here. Are CMMC assessments taking place right now? And can somebody become CMMC compliant? I know you've answered it, but I want it to be re-emphasized for those that may have missed
No
what's.
problem. Yeah, to answer your question, yes, CMMC assessments are being conducted right now. And really the time for compliance is now. You sort of have every resource available to you right now as a company to prepare for CMMC, in the sense that the program has been finalized. We know the roadmap, meaning we have the scoping guides, we have the assessment guides, wherein a company can prepare and understand how they're going to be assessed. And we also have the underlying cybersecurity standard, which is NIST INDRA 171. So there is no lack of clarity, if you will, or ambiguity as to what is expected or required to attain certification. And through the finalization of the CMMC program that we discussed back in December, now assessors are actually able to conduct CMMC assessments so that companies can actually obtain that certification that they need in order to be eligible for future government contracts.
Well, thank you again for clarifying that. And one more question on that. Could you tell the audience a little bit about this alphabet soup of JSVAs? What are they, and what is CMMC compliance through a C3PAO now? So I know these are things that we all understand, but there's so much of alphabet soup over here. I want the audience to also understand what was the JSVA program, what did it end up doing, and what's the CMMC C3PAO compliance right now?
So the Joint Surveillance Voluntary Assessment Service was a program that was conducting CMMC assessments prior to the finalization of the CMMC program. And what that was the DoD stated, well, you can actually go through this JSV assessment since we don't have the CMMC program finalized right now. We're going to conduct it against the same NIST Interjet 171 standard. At this point in time, you can have then that assessment conducted. And if you have a perfect passing score, once the program is codified, then you can reapply and then obtain your certification assessment. So that was occurring last year prior to the CMMC program being finalized. Now that we are in this era of the CMMC program finalization, the JSV has essentially been sunset in the sense that there really is no longer a need for it. And since the CMMC program itself is active and functioning, that now companies can actually go through the official CMMC program, be assessed by a C3PAO, and assessed against the official criteria for CMMC level 1, 2, or 3, and then obtain that assessment. So again, you will have that certification in hand. Present day, you don't have to wait for it anymore, so to speak.
And so, with the current assessments, again, to belabor the point over here, a company can actually get a certificate that is an official CMMC certificate that says, I am CMMC level 2 compliant, for example.
Correct.
Okay. Again, I want to make sure everything is super clear over here. You explained very clearly the difference between CFR 32, which is the CMMC rule, and the CFR 48, which is the DFARS regulation that'll put CMMC into contracts. Could you tell us a little bit about when will CMMC requirements begin appearing in solicitations and contracts post CFR 48? And based on the current rule, again, emphasize what is possible right now. So tell us a little bit about the timeline of how things are in contracts right now, and then what happens with 48, and then how does that impact insertion into contracts going forward?
So as I was mentioning earlier, as a former contracting officer, any CO has the prerogative to include any contract requirements that they, in conjunction with their program office, deem necessary for a variety of reasons, but particularly in this instance, due to the sensitivity of the data that a contractor might handle. All that to say, that's why we're seeing in some solicitations and in some, even contract administration, contracting officers inquiring about CMMC status or requiring CMMC certificates now as a condition of award. So we're seeing that in select instances. That's divergent, or that's sort of an exception, if you will, to the broader rollout, or what the DoD referred to as phased implementation for the CMMC program. And what that means is once that final rule for the clause, that's DFARS clause 252-204-7021, it was a clause that was released back in 2021, if I recall correctly, but it's been dormant during the CMMC rulemaking. Once that clause has been updated and we see that this new final rule in the 48 CFR, that will then usher in this quote phased implementation. And there's 4 phases that the DoD has fleshed out. The first phase 1 occurs at the date of that 48 CFR finalization. And at that point in time, the DoD stated that then level 1 requirements and level 2 requirements would begin to appear at the self-assessment level in select solicitations and contracts as a condition of award. And I think that that's notable, is that those are only self-assessments, meaning that those are assessments that a company themselves would conduct by reviewing the applicable standards. Again, level 1 applies to federal contract information. That's taken from a separate FAR clause 52204-21 and pertains to 17 select controls from that insane NIST standard I was referring to earlier. A company would self-certify or self-assess that they've implemented those and then update or make an attestation online, ideally in the supplier performance risk system, also known as SPRS. The same too would occur for select contractors that are at the level 2 level, which means if you're handling controlled and classified information, you would then review those 110 controls and then verify that you meet them and then attest to compliance through that. After 1 year of the 48 CFR being finalized, that would usher in phase 2. At that point in time, those official C3PO assessments would be a requirement in applicable solicitations and contracts as a condition of award. So again, that's 1 year after the release of this final rule for the CMMC clause. Phase 3 occurs 2 years after the release of the rule, and C3POs or those external assessments would be required as a condition for option exercises. I'm sure many of you out there are familiar with that, but again, if you have a contract, and sometimes one of my favorite contract awards was a base plus 4 options, right? Where you have a contract where you have the base award and then you have 4 option periods that a CO can elect to extend, meaning every year thereafter they can say, yes, we still want continued service. We're going to exercise this option, and then you would receive a contract modification that would then sort of activate a new period of performance, a new year of work. At this phase 3, that having that C3PO assessment would be a condition of having option exercises. And as well at level 3 for CMMC, this is for high value critical assets of CUI that contractors are handling. There would also be requirements to have DIBCAC actually conduct an assessment. And DIBCAC stands for the Defense Industrial Base Cybersecurity Assessment Center. That's operated out of the Defense Contract Management Agency, also known as DCMA. What that's referring to is that you would have to actually have a government assessment to ensure that you're implementing both the requirements of NIST 800-171 as well as the requirements of an elevated standard referred to as NIST 800-172. For CMMC level 3, there are select controls from 172 in addition to the full suite of controls from NIST 171. Lastly, phase 4 occurs 3 years after the release of the clause rule, and that's when, again, the DoD is sort of stating that there will be full implementation of CMMC requirements in all solicitation, contracts, and option exercises. So I'm going to ask you a test on that one, Sanjeev, after I overloaded you with lots of information and details and see if you can pass it. No, I'm joking.
I think I could pass it.
I think you could. You're on top of it.
I delve into the details. But I want to make sure that the point that you made about self-assessments isn't misinterpreted. And we'll go into this a little bit more in detail. Suppose I say, well, Michael said something about in phase 1, we'll basically go and do some self-assessments. So I'm just going to go and say that I'm CMMC level 2 compliant. I did a self-assessment and I kind of was generous in grading myself and overtly generous. What's the implication and the risk associated with that?
I appreciate that clarification. I think it's vitally important. There are 2 different types of assessments that the CMMC program delineates. There's a self-assessment, and then there's the actual official CMMC assessments conducted by a third party. That third-party assessment will be required for 95% of contractors. At least that's what was stated in the final rule for the CMMC program. So again, 95% of contractors that are handling regulated data like controlled and classified information will eventually have to obtain that third-party assessment. As I was mentioning within the phased implementation, there is a requirement to conduct an initial self-assessment against those CMMC controls that will be required at phase 1. And so you may see then that in the near term, but that doesn't fully get you into CMMC compliance, meaning that you still have to go through that external third-party assessment to obtain that sort of final certification that's sort of necessary to be a player in that ecosystem. The last point, though, I do want to go back to, and I think is vitally important again, with regards to self-assessment, is that conducting a self-assessment either under NIST 800-171 or under the CMMC practices is not merely just reading through them and then saying, yep, we did that, checkbox and moving on. Conducting that self-assessment presupposes that you already have, again, that robust documentation that I was referring to as a system security plan. That's very clear in the prior DFARS clauses that we might touch on that are other kind of existing cyber requirements right now. But again, in order to complete and conduct a self-assessment and then to upload a score or attestation, the requirement and the government presumes that you already have that written documentation. And that lack of documentation in some instances is exactly where we're seeing the Department of Justice bring forth enforcement actions against companies because they're saying, wait a second, you uploaded that you met these requirements, but you didn't have the underlying written documentation. That's a misrepresentation. You're not complying with the requirements. That's a serious issue. So just to say as a sobering point, again, it's not just reviewing standards and just saying, yeah, I think we meet that. It's again, looking at very wide-eyed and ensuring that you've implemented those and written expressly how you've implemented them and having that underlying supporting documentation before you complete those self-assessments.
So, in other words, the kind of a little bit laissez-faire approach that used to exist a few years ago, where you say, yeah, kind of meet it. Let's say we did a rudimentary assessment and we meet it, is no longer viable. That if you go and say that you assessed, that there are many tools available to the government to actually ensure and enforce that you actually did that. And so, say a little bit more about the DOJ and how they could step in into the process to ensure that when you say that you're assessing yourself, you're actually doing it seriously.
Yeah. So I think, when we look at areas of cyber enforcement, I think if we even go back the last 10 years, that there's sort of been this increase of data breaches of sensitive government data of the federal government. And the government continued to look at that. And that, frankly, was the impetus for many of the DoD cybersecurity clauses that we've seen over time. When we look back 10 years ago, that was around the time that the DFAR safeguarding clause was first released. And then several years after that, there was a self assessment requirement that many known as sort of as spurs, where again, you're conducting that assessment, uploading it into that system. All those occurred because the government found that the defense industrial base, that was really the greatest area of vulnerability, that nation state threat actors were actually conducting cyber attacks against companies that did not have sophisticated IT security in place. And they were obtaining significant national security information and warfare secrets from the US federal government. As a result of that perpetuated noncompliance, even though there were these contract requirements, the DoD, in concert with the DOJ, stood up the DOJ Civil Cyber Fraud Initiative that also began in 2021. Since that point in time, we've seen many, many investigations from the Department of Justice where they have investigated areas of noncompliance of federal contractors. What's notable about that is they're using a specific legal tool or vehicle referred to as the False Claims Act that's been around for decades. However, what's unique about it is there is a key TAM provision. And what that means is there's a whistleblower provision where, again, we're seeing in the DOJ's incentivize whistleblowers to come forward, where, again, if they're finding areas of noncompliance within a company's cybersecurity, that they're reporting them to the Department of Justice, and the Department of Justice is then initiating various types of investigations based upon that, where they elect to intervene or not and take on that case. As a result of that, we've seen again a myriad of investigations, enforcement actions, and in many cases, many settlements in the tens of millions of dollars from contractors, particularly for not complying with NIST Standard 171, for not complying with the DFAR safeguarding clause, for not using cloud security requirements that meet the various baseline standards like FedRAMP, as well as having insufficient written documentation. So all that to say that this is an area of rampant enforcement. And oh, by the way, I'll also call out that the most recent settlement that was just released last week for a company referred to as Morse Core, they settled for $5 million for failure to meet various cyber requirements. Much of those enforcement actions, or particularly that was brought forth from Morse Core, were all due to unprivileged external assessments, meaning that that company utilized a vendor not under attorney-client privilege, and that information found discrepancies or unveiled discrepancies where the company was found by their external assessor to have a score of a negative 142. However, the score that was uploaded into the supplier performance risk system was a positive 104. So we can see the vast delta there. Obviously, there's many things to discuss of that, but again, going back to that unprivileged nature, that was what revealed in that information to the government as part of that enforcement.
I mean, these are really important, and objective data points that you're sharing with us, and I'm very grateful for that. I think the key message over here is don't be loosey-goosey on the SPRS score requirement, and take this thing seriously, objectively, and sort of rigorously.
Agreed.
So moving on, one of the things that we say is obviously you got to get moving and get ready for CMMC. But we draw a distinction between readiness and assessment. So I want to ask you, Michael, to clarify for the audience the difference between being assessment ready and undergoing an actual CMMC assessment, and why focusing on being assessment ready now is crucial.
Sure. I mean, I think the pre-audit readiness, I think, is really vital. Because if a company hasn't really prepared for that assessment, it's highly unlikely they're going to meet sort of all the dotting of the I's and the crossing of the T's that's really necessary, but there's such a high degree of scrutiny that's required to actually pass a third-party assessment under the CMMC program. So it's really important that companies invest the time and the resources, again, for ideally that privileged readiness assessment, where then the company is having someone else, again, externally to sort of pressure test that and to sort of look at whatever documentation exists, whatever internal technology that's been implemented to determine if, for instance, your firewalls are fully erected in a way that are not penetrable, or that you're using a data loss prevention tool in a way that is effectively scanning for information and meeting the intent of the requirements, or that your MFA is deployed throughout your entire network and not through just sort of one subset. All these nuances matter. And again, if you might have well intending sort of IT staff that are trying to implement these controls, they can be, again, so nuanced that sometimes the government is assessing them in a way different than the industry may interpret it. And you may lose some of those nuances, again, if you're operating in a siloed kind of manner. And that's why it's really important and an investment on that readiness component to then prepare to ensure that you actually are implementing the controls in an accurate and complete way, and that you have that underlying policy and supporting documentation, or as CMC refers to them as artifacts, to demonstrate that you're meeting each of those individual practices so that then you're ready for that official assessment. When you have the C3PO on site, they're not asking where is X, Y, and Z. You already have it all in hand and you're confident you're ready to go. Because again, if you're trying to pull it together last minute, it's likely you're going to have gaps and you're going to be found to then not be meeting the controls. And that's just only going to sort of bottleneck the process even more, or you can fail the certification altogether.
So, Michael, what we often say from a pragmatic perspective is it's crucial for everybody to be ready, put the IT systems, put the documentation frameworks, the system security plan, all the things that you've talked about in place right now, and, keep hardening yourselves, but that it may be perfectly appropriate for you to undergo an actual CMMC assessment several years down the road. Would you disagree with that advice or find flaw at that?
I think the only issue I would take pause with is sort of saying, well, we can wait 2 years for a CMMC assessment. I think it depends, about every company's current business goals, operations, and contract activity, right? If you have a large portfolio of DoD contracts and you're handling sensitive government data like CUI, it would be surprising that you would be able to sort of wait several years without having that CMMC certificate and continue to receive additional contracts. But again, if it depends upon the client's portfolio. So all that to say, every company has different objectives and sort of different priorities at the time. But again, if you're wanting to be a key player in the DoD marketplace, and if, as part of that, if you're required to handle CUI, meaning if you're not, producing exclusively commercially off-the-shelf products or services, which most do not, and if you're handling them that regulated data, then you really need to have that certification, or it's likely you're going to miss out on future business opportunities, either directly from the government or within the defense industrial base supply chain. Because I know for many of the other contractors that we counsel, sort of up and down the supply chain, many are receiving flow downs from either higher tier primes or subs or higher tier subs that are also asking sort of where you are you within that. Because again, many primes are not going to want to miss out on future opportunities because their suppliers or supply chain are also not meeting those requirements. So again, it's sort of a competitive advantage thing to think about. Where again, if federal business is an integral part of your business, maybe not even directly with the government, but within your supply chain, so too should you take that into account with regards to your preparedness.
I think your perspective is spot on. And while I was a little bit, terse in my summarizing of our counsel, in essence, that's what we say, that it's a vital tool for being competitive. There's no path but to be ready right now. But you can, based on your strategic objective, determine the right time. But for most people that have a reasonable exposure to DoD contracts, it's a question of competitive advantage to have an actual CMMC assessment sooner rather than later. So I want to move on to the final topic, again, related to this conversation of CMMC and why it's important to be ready right now. And that pertains to DFAR 7012. So tell us a little bit about what are current obligations under DFAR 7012 and what risks do companies face by not complying with DFAR 7012 today. And going further, to clarify for the audience, what's the difference between DFAR 7012 and CMMC?
I love that question because I have to say sometimes I will in some ways find it amusing that some companies are so resistant to saying, "Well, why do we have to do CMMC? We don't wanna do CMMC." But they've been operating in an environment where they're handling that same data for the last 10 years, and they likely already have contract clauses in their contracts, like the DFAR 7012 clause, that essentially require the same thing right now. And I think that that is, I think, an interesting thing that companies are wrestling with, and that some companies that are resistant to it, I think, don't realize that you likely already have these same exact contract requirements to meet a lot of the fundamental same cybersecurity standards. And by not meeting them, you're setting yourself up for those enforcement actions, like I was just mentioning from the Department of Justice. But really going back to the DFAR 7012 clause, what that is and what it requires, the DFAR 7012, for those of you who are not familiar, is the Safeguarding of Covered Defense Information and Cyber Incident Reporting Clause. It's DFAR's 252-204-7012. And what that requires is sort of three requirements. The first is to provide adequate security, as it's referred to in that clause. And by providing adequate security, is you're implementing that same cybersecurity standard, NIST Standard 171, throughout your environment, wherever that regulated data, that controlled unclassified information flows. And to demonstrate your compliance, you have that written system security plan. And for any open controls that you've not fully met, you have a plan of action and milestones. The second requirement under that clause is to report any cyber incidents as that term cyber incident is defined under that same 7012 clause. That's a lot of what we do, particularly at Crowell and Mooring, where we counsel many defense contractors and where they may have had a potential cyber incident. And there's many nuances of determining whether there are or are not reporting requirements to the federal government, to other prime or subcontractors, or to provide individual notice depending upon the type of incident. Again, there too, we'll conduct privileged IT forensic investigations to sort of investigate a potential incident and then determine whether notice is provided or not. But I'll flag, going back to the Department of Justice and the False Claims Act, one of the areas of enforcement also is failure to timely report data breaches. All that to say, what you do and how you respond to an incident is also vitally important. The third requirement of the DFAR 7012 clause is to flow down those requirements throughout your supply chain when you have a supplier or subcontractor that's also handling that CUI. So those are the requirements of DFAR 7012. And so when we think about, CMMC and 7012, it's really not that different, particularly from an IT security standpoint. The last part that I'll mention under 7012 that I didn't call out yet is, again, the usage of cloud security. Cloud service providers, SaaS-based providers, platforms as a service, all these cloud solutions, again, if we have regulated data in the cloud, the requirement is to ensure that we're using a FedRAMP moderate or equivalent in certain instances solutions. If not, that is also not meeting the requirements from an IT security perspective. And that is exactly other areas where we've seen government enforcement actions being brought against contractors. But in terms of comparing and contrasting DFAR 7012 and CMMC itself, what are the similarities? What are the differences? As I mentioned, the core fundamental IT requirements are mostly the same. What I see as being the key differences really are enhancements, if you will, under the CMMC regime. The first being the sub-objectives that I mentioned earlier on. Those are taken from a specific assessment requirement referred to as NIST 800-171A as alpha. It's the assessment guide. But what that did was include many sub-objectives. And while those are still generally required under DFAR 7012, CMMC really elevates those requirements and make them essentially mandatory, where if you do not fully meet any of those and they're highly scrutinizing, you're not meeting the controls. So that's one area to think about. But it's something else that I think is also incredibly important to be aware of under CMMC. And we've not discussed this to date. And I know that we're near the end of our time, but I think every executive should be aware of this, is under CMMC, there's also a requirement to provide affirmations. And what I mean by that is that every company that is actually obtaining a CMMC assessment must attest that the information provided to their C3PAO was accurate and complete, and that they will actually maintain implementation of those controls throughout the life and duration of the contract. That's important because anytime we're providing a written affirmation to the government, we're making a binding representation, right? And so we can all, I think, appreciate the legal risk that is being elevated of a company. And the requirement for this attestation is that it would be a senior official responsible for the IT implementation within that company. So I just want to call that out and distinguish that. And under CMMC and moving to the future, the government is going to require sort of, again, further certifications from each contractor that what they're doing is actually accurate and complete. And that only is elevating the risk for company. But I think in due course, in the sense that the government wants to ensure that what companies are attesting to is actually accurate.
Well, Michael, I can't thank you enough for your valuable insights. I've been doing these webinars quite a bit, and I must say that the clarity with which you presented the information and the objective evidence to substantiate the points that you were making stands out for being among the very best that I have ever seen. So I want to thank you, and I stand by what I said that this should be sort of mandatory viewing for CEOs and CIOs of defense contractors. To our audience, thank you so much for participating. I think Michael's message is clear. CMMC is advancing, the final rules in effect, and DoD leadership is committed to enforcing its rollout. So it's important that while you may not be teeing up immediate certification, the prudent approach is to prepare now, align your IT systems with 800-171 standards, complete your documentation, complete any outstanding poems, and ensure that you comply with your current obligations under DFAR 7012, which are exactly the same. And also, Michael's contact information is on the screen. And should you or your firm be interested in seeking, further guidance and counsel from Michael, don't hesitate to contact him. So stay secure and move on ahead with your preparation. Thank you so very much, everybody, for joining. And thank you again, Michael. I truly appreciate your participation today.
Thank you for having me.